Hi everybody. Gosh, I'm so sorry we didn't have sound. Thank you so much for telling me. I don't know what happened there. Hopefully now you will be able to hear me. I'm just gonna make sure that you're coming up on the computer. Okay. If somebody could just kindly tell me that you can hear me this time. I'm doing it without the microphone, just using the iPad sound. So I really hope you can hear me. And we'll start again. Okay. I'm hoping that I'm going to just see some of your names coming up if somebody could tell you. I really do value you letting me know this. Let's see if we have any questions. Oh, you can hear me. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for your patience too. I really don't know what happened there. The microphones were on. Anyway, welcome to Knitter Matters. So it's season 2, episode 15. Whether you're a regular viewer or this is your first time watching Knitter Matters, thank you very much for joining us. I really do appreciate you taking the time to be with me. And if you are new, a very special welcome to you. So I'm Cheryl Lampard, I'm an image consultant. My company is Style Matters International. And throughout my life, my two passions have been sewing and knitting. And knitting in particular is the thing that I love to do. It's relaxing, it's my therapy. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I can see what you're seeing. It's my therapy, and I know that it is for a lot of you too. I also had the great pleasure of being the owner of a yarn store in Brighton, England many years ago. And one of the real joys of that is that I got to teach people how to knit. And it's a real joy to be able to do that all these years later, albeit by a different platform. But you know, it's almost better teaching now because I can reach more people and introduce more people to this wonderful this wonderful fibre art of knitting. And knitting is a huge trend again, and we knitters know that it's never not been trendy, and we know it's never gone out of style, but it's really good to see the fashion pages for spring and summer and basically into fall and winter as well. There's lots of knitted fashion, and not least the trend for sweater vests and what we used to call back in the day tank tops, but of all sorts of lengths, crop ones, really long ones, sleeveless sweaters. They're really big this year. Of all different sort of shapes and silhouettes. So if you're knitting one of those at the moment, you're going to be ahead of the game. So today our subject is knitting with circular needles. And if you've been with Knitter Matters since season 1, you may recall that in season 1, episodes 14 and 15, and I've just realised the coincidence of that because of course this is season 2, episode 15. So in the first season, episodes 14 and 15 were about knitting in the round, and in particular, episode 15 was about using circular needles for knitting in the round. But you don't only have to use circulars for knitting in the round. Obviously, that's one of the reasons that we have them or we use them, but they're much more versatile than that. So I'm just going to move the camera now to my little chalk spot and we'll get going on some of the things. Just give me a second here. Just let me find my chalk and let me make sure that that's coming through. Oh, hi Marie. Hi Bob. Hi Rhonda. Thank you for bearing with me there. I will try and say hello as your names pop up, but forgive me if I miss you. I can only see a certain amount while I'm doing the live. And as always, I welcome your feedback. I welcome your feedback and any comments that you have either as we're going along. I can't probably see them to answer them as we go along, but I'll answer them as soon as possible afterwards. And on that subject, if you're watching this later on a different group and you ask me a question or you write to me a question, if I don't answer it straight away, do let me know. Do private message me, because sometimes I know there's a question and then when I try and find it, I can't find it because it's buried in a group somewhere. So if I ever don't respond to you, do feel free to private message me. Let me just make sure, see if I can see any more comments coming up. Okay. If not, just we'll keep going. So these are some items that we did before in last year or in last season, and obviously these are typical knitting in the round, and this is another knitted in the round, and we talked about jogless joins and things like that. But I want to talk today about really what we're using circulars for and how to use them differently. But I will also be demoing a couple of really useful techniques for using with circular needles. So let's talk first about the two types of circular needles. There are regular, sort of fixed circulars, and there are interchangeables, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, the needle sizing, the needle sizing, by that I mean the working tip. The working tip here, whether it's this tiny little one, which is a US size 0, a 2 millimeter, or this hulking great big beast, which is a US 19, and I'm not sure of the millimeter size of that. I've rubbed it off in knitting, but this is going to be the same as a straight needle size. You can get straight needles in these sizes. So the tips, or the working part of the needle, they're going to be the same. If you buy a 6, it's going to be a 6, whether it's a straight needle or a circular. But what is different is the length, and the length is down to the cable. However, having said that, the measurement for a circular needle is the whole length. It's not just the cable length. So let's, oh, this one's a bit springy. Let me get another one. So they tend to range in size from, I think 9 inches is probably the smallest one that you can get, and up to about 60 inches. And when you are choosing a needle, you're going to measure it tip to tip. Okay, so this one is a 16 inch, and that's, I'll skew this round because I'm sort of a different size. I'm in a slightly different position from the camera, but you can hopefully just see there that that tip comes to 16 inches. Now, if you're just buying them in a pack, then you'll know it will be printed on the pack, the length. But if you find a range in a drawer, or you've been gifted some by somebody else and there's no real indication of the length, you'll want to measure them. So do be sure that you measure tip to tip. So this is a 16 inch. As I say, the smallest is probably a 9 inch. But if you think about it, there's very little cable on a 9 inch, because although the tip size, the working needle size will change depending how long, to some degree, how long the cable is, how long the needle is. The tip sizes are usually 4 to 5 inches. On this little one, I think we can see that it's actually, where's my tape measure again? Yep, it's just short of 4 inches there, 3 3/4 inches. On this one, which is a much longer needle altogether, this is a 5 inch tip. So the smaller the needle gets, the shorter that tip is going to be. And if you think about it, it has to be, because if you can actually get a 9 inch circular, that's very small. If you think about it, if this is nearly 4 inches, 2 of those, that's the best part, that's about 7.5 inches. That means you only have 1.5 inches of cables. So when you do get a 9 inch, the tip is going to be something like, 1.5 inches. They're very small to work with, and you might not find that comfortable. But anyway, you can get them. Now, if you're lucky enough to be able to get a needle that has a choice of tip length, the standard is 4 inches to 5 inches. Personally, if I have the choice, I like a 5 inch tip. I have quite big hands, and I find that a 4 inch, this one, if I'm using this one, it tends to sort of dig in the heel of my hand. So a 5 inch to me is more comfortable. But if you have small hands, or it's personal preference. So sometimes you don't have the option, but if you do, and certainly there are some circulars that you can order and you can have them the length that you want. So, but bear in mind, your hand size and what feels comfortable. Okay. So The other thing, so that's generally, you know, whether they're fixed or interchangeable needles. Now, is there a disadvantage to fixed regular circular needles? Well, really, the disadvantage that I've found is that, remember I said this part is the same size to form the stitch. Well, you might need lots of different lengths in the same needle size, which is what I found I was doing. I was finding lots of projects needed a certain size, but it needed a different length. So I ended up with several needles that were actually the same size, but a completely different length. And that's just in one size. And if you think you might have to do that with a lot of different projects and a lot of different needle sizes, it's quite an expensive way to do it. And you know, you've then got to sort them, you've got to keep them somewhere. So I didn't find that very convenient. And of course, wouldn't you know it, you know, I'd start a new project and I'd find that I didn't have the one size that I wanted, or I had the cable length, but it wasn't in the right size needle. So I invested in a really nice set of interchangeables, and I love them. Let me just show you how interchangeables work if you haven't seen them before. So this is a set that I have, and I particularly like them. There's all sorts of different types you can get. There's different brands. There's wood needles. There's even some square ones. The tips can be a bit squared off. There's wood, there's aluminium, there's steel, there's composites, there's carbon fibers. There's all sorts out there. And I would suggest that you try them out before you invest perhaps in a set like this. You might want to try them out as individual needles first to see if you like the handle of them, to see if you like using them before you make that significant investment. But I had tried these ones out many times and bought several of the fixed circulars in this brand, and I really like them. Anyway, so what typically happens, you have a set like this. These are the interchangeable parts, and then you'll have the cables. And this set comes with small and large, but also several different sizes. This is one that's just to hand at the moment. And what you do, it has a little T-pin. So you screw these in. You screw these in. Now, if you have a set like this, the real magic happens, and don't ask me how it works, but actually screwing it up like that, that's never gonna unwind itself. Well, leastways, I won't say it never will. In all the time that I've used these needles and used this little tool, and sometimes it's a different shape, but it's basically this idea. It gives you a bit more leverage when you turn that and fix it. I have never known these unwind while I'm knitting, because that can happen with circulars, and I've had that can happen with interchangeables, and I've had some very expensive interchangeables that's happened with, and some cheap ones that it's never happened with. So, you know, it's just one of those strange things. But if it has this little tool, use it, because that will really help that not unwind. As I say, I've never known that unwind when I've used that. The other use for this little hole is a lifeline. Now, if you don't know what a lifeline is, we did mention it in previous episodes, but if you're doing a really tricky pattern or you're knitting and it's a very complicated section, it's always worth putting in a lifeline. You can certainly do that after you've knitted the bit, but you can do it while you're knitting with this. And all you would do, you need a slightly thinner yarn. You're going to poke that through. You could just secure it with a knot, and you're going to knit as normal. And what will happen, that just goes through the loops of the stitches. You're not going to knit this in. It just goes along that row. Then once you've done that row, you can unknot it and just leave it sitting there. And you know that sort of, 10 rows off, if you realize that you've made a mistake, or however a few rows later, if you realize you made a mistake in that complicated row, you can just rip back to that row and you've saved those stitches. And so I would suggest putting a lifeline in after a really complex row when you know that it's right, and then you can rest easy for a little while, and and know that if you do have to rip back at all, you've only got to rip back a certain way. So, you know, if you have this sort of needle, you're going to be able to use that as a lifeline. So that's another nice little feature. Okay, the other thing that's whether you're getting fixed regular needles or interchangeable ones, one really important thing is that the join between the cable and the knitting tip has to be smooth. Really needs to be smooth. Sometimes you can't really feel it, but if there's a snag or the join isn't exactly perfect, sometimes when you're knitting, you'll feel it on your yarn. Your yarn will snag, and you know it's going to wear the yarn out, and apart from that it's going to be an irritation. So this smoothness here is super important. So do try that. I've had needles which should be better quality than they are, and it snags, or it's a bulky join there, not nice. I don't want to use those. So you know, that's a really important thing. When it comes to the cables themselves, I love these. I've said that before, I know, but I do like these, and one of the main reasons is because this is a steel cable that's covered in it's a sort of nylon finish, I think. But this cable has no memory. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I can roll that up and put that in my, you know, little kit. And when I open it again, it's not going to retain that springiness in terms of it's going to be completely flat for me to knit with, which is lovely. Because sometimes I have found, and this is a, you know, I've kept them in my kit and now I want to knit with it, and this one, for example, it just keeps springing back. It happens more, the longer they are, the more it happens, but you can see the difference really there. And this one, you know, this is lying flat. If I want this to lie flat, I've got to kind of unwind it. I've probably got to steam it, and I can do that. It's not the end of the world, but it's one more thing that I've got to do before I can start my knitting. So I would prefer to just have a nice non-memory cable before I start. Okay, so that's lots of talk about, let me just make sure I've got my right needles. This is the one that I've just, yeah, let me put that aside. Okay, let me put that back and out the way, clear the decks a bit. Right, so why else would we want to use a circular if we're not actually knitting in the round? Well, this shawl that I've been working on for a long time, and I've shown you several times in its certain as I progress with it, and I'm nearly there now. I'm just working on this wing on this other side, but I've got these stitches on a circular, not because actually there's a huge amount of stitches there at the moment, but I just find it more comfortable to have the weight of this piece in my lap. Now, I do know when I come to actually do the border around the edge of this shawl, I'm going to have several hundred stitches, and I'm going to need to have a circular there because I'm going to have to pick up, you know, I'm going to have to pick around the shaping, around one wing, then down to the pointy bit. I'm going to have several hundred stitches on my needle, and I'm going to have to maneuver around this shapes, especially sort of this curve around the neck. So I wouldn't be able to do that on a straight needle. I wouldn't be able to put all those stitches on it, and I certainly wouldn't be able to move around those, you know, shaped bits as easily with a straight needle. So that's one reason why you would certainly want to use a circular needle. A friend actually emailed me a couple of weeks ago, and she was making a baby cardigan. Now that's a small garment, and the pattern asked for a circular, and she wasn't sure how to use the circular. And it turned out that there was a border all around this sweet little cardigan, a scalloped border from the neck all the way down the front edges, round the back of the hair, you know, down the side hems, round the back, and then up again to the neckline. So she needed a circular for that. And, you know, it was used in the same way that you knit straight. There was no joining of it, but it meant she could get all those stitches on it and maneuver around the shape of the cardigan. So the other reason is, and I mentioned it just now, if you're working on a big piece, that can be heavy in your hands. And if you have any hand issues, or you have wrist issues or arthritis of any kind, and I have a bit of arthritis in my hands, and too much weight sort of in my hands, especially on the needles, it kind of hurts. So I prefer the weight to be in my lap. And if you're using circulars, that's what you'll get. So do think about that if you have hand issues, whether it's arthritis or carpal tunnel syndrome. That can really help using circulars. And you can also use circulars for knitting small seamless tubes, i.e. fingers on gloves. Now, usually we would use double-pointed needles for small tubes of knitting. But you might not have the right size double-pointed needle, or you simply don't like them, as I do not like DPNs. They are not my favorite thing. So there is a technique known as the magic loop. I did demo this back in season 1, episode 15, but it's such a useful technique. I'll show you again. You'll be glad you know this one. So the technique was invented by Sarah Hauschka, I think it is. Hauschka, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And it was popularized in a book by Bev Galeskis in 2002 called The Magic Loop, not surprisingly. Now, for a magic loop, you're going to need probably a 32-inch circular. You can use longer, certainly. It does depend on the project. If it's just really quite a few small amount of stitches, you possibly could do a 24-inch. Anything less than that gets a bit tricky. But this is really useful for the cuffs of socks or things like that, where it's a fairly small tube. Or, you know, if you're doing a mitten, something like that. So you might not have the right DPNs, you might not have the right length of cable. So this is a really good one. And it's a bit fiddly at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. So we're going to cast on the number of stitches that we need. I'm going to just use a long tail cast on, and I'm going to cast on 16, I think, here. That'll be plenty for you to see what I'm doing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Let's just count. It doesn't really matter if I've got a few more or a few less. Okay, I have got 16. Okay, I hope that's not going to be too tight at that end. Okay, so now I'm going to slide those down onto my cable. So I've only got 16 here, but you could equally have something like 40 or 50. And I'm going to roughly find the middle of that cable. And I'm going to pull that, I'm going to bend the cable. As I say, roughly I'm finding the middle. It doesn't have to be exactly 8 on that side, 8 on that side. You know, you're just finding the middle. Now I'm going to make sure, so I'm going to flip this over. I need to make sure that my working yarn, let's get the tail out of the way, is on the, if you will, the back needle. I'm going to slide this up. Okay, I'm going to make sure that's not twisted. So I'm going to slide both these up to the tips of my needle. And I need to make sure, this is the time that you make sure of two things, that your working yarn is at the back and that your stitches aren't twisted. Okay. I've only got 16 stitches here. It's not the end of the world if I have to do that again. But if I've got, you know, quite a few more, I don't really want to have to unravel them. So I'm going to make sure that's not twisted. So this is what I call the starting position for the magic loop. The points are in my left hand and they're facing to the right. So I'm going to pull this back needle out through the loops and bring it round. I'm going to make sure that I can knit with this. I'm going to bring it round. This is the one that I'm going to knit. So I'm going to join in the round now. making sure that I'm using my working yarn, not the tail, which I have been known to do. So I'm going to knit to the end of my stitches there. And now I've run out of needle, or rather I've run out of stitches. So what do I do now? Well, I find this easier to turn this round straight away. Then you're going to push this needle back along there. Remember, we haven't knitted that one yet. And I made those stitches a little bit tight when I cast on. Oh, I'll get there in the end. Oh dear, I did do those tightly, especially that last one. Oh dear. Yeah, don't cast on as tightly as I've done there. I have a tendency to do that. Oh golly, push, push, push. There we go. Yeah, learn by my mistakes. I cast on a bit too tightly there. So now we're back to our starting position, and I'm going to bring this one round now. This is my working yarn. Get the tip. It's all, once you get started, it's much, much easier. And I'm going to knit these stitches. Okay. So I'm always knitting the stitches sort of towards the front. Okay. There we go. There we go. Now I'm going to turn that round straight away. I always find it easier to do that. It sort of lets me get my bearings. Then I'm going to push that loop. Whoops, try not to lose the stitch. I'm going to push that front needle, the loops on that, the stitches that I've just knitted, to the tip of my needle again. Just make sure that doesn't fall off. There we go. Oh, there we go. My hands are getting sticky. It's very warm today in Florida. Got the air conditioning right up. Anyway, pull this one out. Bring it round to the front. Just make sure you don't get an accidental yarn over. Otherwise you'll end up with another stitch. I'll just do one more row. And obviously you can sort of tighten up that before you start. So that is your magic loop. And it's really very simple once you get going. Again, I find it much easier to just bring that, turn that as soon as I've done that. Push that one up, and as you can see, it's already getting easier because I've got a couple of rows on my needles. Just one more, and then I'll show you another technique. Just make sure not to get that caught up as a yarn over. Okay, so this is the magic loop, and it is, I don't know how they came up with this, but it is really very clever. And as I say, if you haven't got the right size DPNs, or your circular isn't the right length for what you want to do, this is the way to do it. And as you can see, you can get a very small piece of tubular knitting on that. I mean, that could feasibly be the finger of a glove, and you can still do it on a long needle like that. So that's the magic loop technique. And the more you do it, as soon as you get a few rows on the needle, it sort of becomes just a very rhythmic exercise where you're sort of pushing the needle tip up, you're sliding the loop down. But that's the basis of it. Okay. The other one I want to show you is a really novel technique, and it's using two circulars to basically do a very similar thing. I really like this one. So the thing about this one, your needles need to both be the same size in terms of, so I'm just moving something out the way then that's in the way of what I'm doing. So, and I did this, I used two circulars when I knitted this mitt a few episodes ago. I was up in Warwick, I didn't have all my tools with me, and so I needed to try a different technique, and I used the two circular needles to knit this in the round. Okay, so certainly can be done. So where you start off with this, you need two needles that are the same size in terms of the knitting area. The knitting tips need to absolutely be the same size. These are a US 6 or a 4mm, but they're both the same size. Ideally, you want them the same length, but that is not a deal breaker. These are both 24 inches. They could be as small, in this instance, they could certainly be as small as 16 inches, or they could be longer. Just remember that if you use very long ones here, you're going to spend a long time trying to find the tips. So I wouldn't have anything that's super long, but if that's what you've got, that's what you've got. And you can even do this with two different lengths. So I could easily do this with one that's a 16 and one that's a 24. It's not going to make any difference on that. So that's not a problem. Now, again, I might normally suggest that you use the same brand of needles or the same type of needle. So if you're using metal needles, use both metal. If you're using wooden, use both wooden, so that you get a consistent gauge, because even though needles are the same size, different brands do vary very, very slightly, and it can affect your gauge. But it does make life easier to use different color needles, or at least the cables be in different colors. So here I'm using two completely different needles. The only similarity is that they're the same size needle tip and the cables are the same length. But you'll see as we go along why it's really helpful to use different colors. So what we're going to do first off, and it doesn't matter which one I do it on, I'm going to cast on, and again I'm going to do 16 stitches. It's a manageable number for you to see what I'm doing. I'm going to use let's not make that first one too tight, Cheryl. Let's learn from your mistake just now. So I'm going to use a long tail cast on. You can use other cast ons. I just like the long tail and I use it a lot. So I'm going to cast on 16 stitches again. And there's certain similarities here. Whoops, I split that one, I think, with the magic loop in this one. But you get the same effect. It's just done differently. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay. Now I'm going to slip half the stitches onto the other needle. I'm going to slip them purlwise. I've tried it both ways. I don't know that it matters too much. I slip them purlwise out of habit. Some people doesn't say it doesn't matter. I just do it out of habit. So I know it's going to be seated the right way when I knit with it. So I'm going to put 8 stitches now on this needle. There we go, 8 stitches. So now I'm going to align the needles, and holding the tips, I'm going to slide both sets of stitches to the other end of the needles. Okay, so I need to get to the other tips because I want to position them so that, again, my working yarn is at the back. And this is the time that you would, again, check that nothing is twisted. You know, if you don't want this being twisted, you need to check that they're both, you know, on this one, on this long tail, it's nice and easy because you can see these purl bumps and they're all facing each other, which is where they should be. So my working yarn is at the back. So there's 2 important things to remember here. You're going to be working on one group of stitches on the same needle at any one time. And that group of stitches is always going to be the front group because we're going to be turning the work around to get to the other set. But you're going to always be working with the same needle. So at the moment, it's my metal needle. So I'm going to bring that tip round to actually start knitting. And somehow logically, my brain, when I first learnt this technique, my brain wanted to bring the opposite needle tip round. But I can tell you that doesn't work. So you're going to be using your same tip. So I've got the metal needle and the red cable. So my working yarn is at the back. I'm going to join that in the round. So that's my join. Now at this point, I'm going to pull this one forward so it's sitting, the back needle, the stitches are on the cable. So then I've got no chance of knocking off those stitches by mistake. If you keep the tips too near each other at that point, especially when you're starting off, it's very easy to knock the stitches off as you knit the ones in the front. You'll see what I mean in a minute if all that sounds gobbledygook. So now I've knitted that first group of stitches on my metal needle. Okay, I'm now going to turn this around. I'm going to pull that so those stitches are on the cable, and I'm going to maneuver this one up so that these stitches are on the needle for me to knit. So let me just show you, if I have both these tips here, like I could, while I'm knitting this one, I run the risk of these one popping off. So if I pull that out, I can be absolutely sure they're not going anywhere. Now I'm going to bring the wooden tip round of this needle, the wooden needle, and I'm going to knit this set of stitches. So remember, it's this, whichever needle you have in front is the one that you're working off, and you turn the work. So that's my first round. Okay, again, now I'm going to turn that round. I'm going to pull that out so it's on the cable, and I'm going to push this one back. By using two different needles, you can certainly use two needles exactly the same. When I made that little mitt that I just showed you, I had two 16-inch bamboo needles and they were exactly the same. But I really had to concentrate on which tip I was picking up. With two different needles, I can see very clearly that if my stitches are on the metal needle, it's the metal tip that I need to use. I'm not going to pick up the wrong one by mistake, because as soon as I do that, I know they're completely different. So if you can, or even if you can only get two different cable colors, then that's fine. But again, you know, I wouldn't go out of your way to do that. Showing you this like this is obviously much easier for you to see what I'm doing. But when you do it, you can certainly do it on two identical needles. You just have to pay a bit more attention. So I'm on my metal needle, I'm bringing that one round, and I'm knitting this group of stitches that are in the front. I really like this on two needles. I don't know whether I like it more than the magic loop, but I like it just as much. I'd always rather do this than DPNs. Yeah, I know some people absolutely love DPNs. It's just personal preference. So again, I'm going to move that round. I'm going to move that so those stitches are safely on the cable. And you don't have to push them as far down as that. I'm just doing it so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to pick up my other end of my wooden tip needle, and I'm going to knit that. And you just keep doing that for the pattern that you need or the length that you need. And there you can see how to knit in the round using two circular needles. Okay. And again, you know, you could just as easily, it's a little bit big for a finger of a glove for me, but it could easily be that. Okay. And the more you grow, the more it'll grow up, obviously. The more you knit, the more it'll grow up. But that's the technique. I really hope you enjoyed that. I think it's a wonderful technique. So that's how you knit on two circulars at the same time. I'm going to move the camera back now. Okay. There we go. Oops. Wibbly wobbly. So, I hope you enjoyed that. So as always, I think I'm wobbly. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I just don't know what happened with the sound, but I really appreciate you staying with me and for telling me. I wouldn't have known. I could have happily done this whole thing and not realised until afterwards. Anyway, thank you for that. So as always, this episode and all others are uploaded to the Facebook page afterwards. They're also on the Star Matters International website. There's a Knit Matters page on that, and they go on our YouTube channel as well. So all those will be uploaded within 24 hours, so you can watch the replays at any time. If you're searching for this replay, it is season 2, episode 15, and as I mentioned, coincidentally, when we did circulars before, that was season 1, episode 15, so it's easy enough to remember. I do hope you will have a go at knitting on circulars, and I hope you'll use them for more than just knitting in the round. I do hope you try the magic loop technique and the knitting on 2 circulars as well. I think you'll find it much easier than perhaps it sounds at first. I know when I first heard of it, I thought, my goodness, yeah, I can't see that working, but it really does. So it's another little tool in your knitting toolbox. So thank you again so much for watching. I do hope you join me again next week for Knit Matters at 7 p.m. Eastern on a Tuesday. And until then, keep calm, keep safe, and keep knitting. Bye for now.